Hey guys, it's me again, back with another vid, time in English. So to give a quick overview, there are four big language families in India. There's other minor ones, but I will be focusing on those four. The biggest one is the Indo-Aryan language family, which is part of the Indo-European language family, which is the biggest in the world. The biggest ones from those are Hindi, Bengali, Marathi, and other ones like Gujarati and Punjabi. Those are spoken in the north primarily. The second biggest one are the Dravidian languages of the south. They are not related whatsoever with the other ones, and they are also not mutually intelligible. There's a few big ones. There's Telugu, Tamil, Malayalam, Kannada, and there's also Tulu on the western coast. The other ones are quite small, but still they have a relatively big speaking community compared to other languages. Those are the Sino-Tibetan languages, spoken more in the north to the Chinese border. One of them would be Sikkimese, spoken in the state of Sikkim. And the other one are the Austroasian families. They are also more in the east. One of them is spoken in Meghalaya, for example, which is called Khasi. And that is the four major families, but I'll be concentrating mainly on the Indo-Aryan ones, as I'm most confident, I think, in that topic. And also, I think it's just more interesting for most people because there you can really see interesting similarities between languages maybe you speak or you know quite well, and which seem maybe a bit alien at first sight, but are actually not that foreign in that sense. Realization of Hindi in everyday life, which is, I think, quite interesting because for someone like me who's a foreigner and who's here now for the second time, but who has spent a lot of time here, it's always fascinating how Hindi is really used in everyday life and in the surrounding of common Indians because at first there's still English, which is really ubiquitous in the Indian state because so many signs are in both Hindi and English, and you can sort of encounter English everywhere, but still there's almost no native speakers. So it's really just the lingua franca of the whole Hindustan region because maybe the most sophisticated people will speak English at home, but it's rather not common for I would say like a middle class or like lower caste common Indian to have much to do with English. It's more like a foreign thing. What I'm getting at is Hindi is used in everyday, but sort of not the pure version you get to see in some other societies or countries. But I feel like in India, still today, there's so many things, like so many abstract concepts, but also so many everyday things you encounter. I will get to examples in a few moments, but there's so many things that are just that feel like they're still English. Maybe, for example, you could say like booking karna, which means to do booking, so to book a room, something like that. I don't think there's a real pure Hindi way of saying that. There's really just the English term book. The same as it's the same with railways. There's Bharatiya Rail, the Indian railways, but of course there's no Hindi word for rails because they didn't have them prior to the Brits. It's just something that occurred to me and which I thought, okay, is maybe worth mentioning. Because that's what makes Hindi also so interesting. Now it's not only a mixture of all those different languages in the surrounding, the Persian, Arabic, Sino-Tibetan influence or whatnot, especially today to a huge degree the English one. And even if the Indians themselves maybe not appreciate the English that much, which I can really understand looking at the past, still those things carry on. Next thing I wrote down was how did Sanskrit eventually evolve into Hindi? I will also keep it easy on that one with Hindi. The larger picture is, of course, that the old Indo-Aryan languages, which one of them is Sanskrit, developed over time through a period which is called Middle Indo-Aryan. One of them is Pali, one of the most important languages of Buddhism, and then eventually into the new Indo-Aryan languages. And those are the ones spoken today. One of them is Hindi. And how did those actually form? That's quite interesting. That's historical linguistic matter. And there's certain shifts or certain developments that happened systematically over time, and which we can see if we compare Sanskrit and, for example, Hindi or other varieties of new Indo-Aryan. So I thought first of all I would like to start with borrowings because I think borrowings are always not that complicated, and borrowings always tell you a lot about a language in its current state. My source material on this one is admittedly only Wikipedia. I have decided to trust the editors. And on Wikipedia there's a list of certain kinds of borrowings, and the first one would be Tat Bhava. That's the Sanskrit name. It means arising from that in Sanskrit. Those would be your classical words that are not borrowed from any other source, but simply just over time or hereditary, sort of hereditary, given onto next generation and then just evolved over time with regular phonologic sound changes. Those are really the ones that we can trace from Old Indo-Aryan through Middle Indo-Aryan to New Indo-Aryan. Maybe the straightforward ones, if you will. One example would be the Sanskrit word jihva, which means tongue, became over the Prakrits. So in Middle Indo-Aryan came jibha, and then now in Hindi we have the word jib. I will come to the changes themselves later, but this is a good example of how a word changes over time and how we can understand those changes. Yeah, maybe if you're not familiar with the term, so when we speak of the languages that came after Sanskrit or after Old Indo-Aryan, we a lot of times encounter the term Prakrit, which is like a counterpart to Sanskrit. Sanskrit means something cultivated, something really pure, something very high, and Prakrit would be vernacular version of that. And also the languages or dialects which later became the languages we have today of certain regions of India. So those Prakrits spread over a certain space. There's like Maharashtri Prakrit, there's like Shauraseni Prakrit, there's like Maugada Prakrit, and there's Elo Prakrit in Sri Lanka, and all of those then developed into the languages that are spoken there. It's really just about how you want to call a dialect or language. The next one in the category is Tat Sama, which means same as that. I like that they all have Sanskrit terms. I think that's quite cool. Those are the ones that are straight borrowed from Sanskrit, which didn't have any phonological changes over time. I didn't write any examples down. All the gods, those names didn't change over time as you would expect, maybe other words, because they always had this sort of ritualistic importance to the Hindu culture. For example, Lord Krishna with an rhotic R and retroflex sh and a retroflex n never changed in its own sense because it was always kept how it is. Words like that of the Tatsama category are just picked from their old source, which is Sanskrit. The next one would be Ardatsama, which means half same as that. That is maybe a bit of a tricky concept to grasp at first because it's more like just a bastard or like a hybrid in its literal sense. For anyone who had Greek knows what I'm talking about. So it's like a mixture of borrowed but also of evolution through time. What I've written down here is Suraj, which is sun, the sun in the sky in Hindi. If you look at the Prakrits, or if you look what would have been the Prakrit version of the Sanskrit word, which is Surya, you would expect something like Suj, where the approximant y becomes j, so an affricate. But it turns out that we don't have a version Suja, we have Suraj, which raises the question, where does this R come from? Because this must have eroded in the Prakrit. The theory now is that this R was later added to mark that it in fact comes from the Sanskrit word Surya. There we have a not really pure form of a word because this word is not how it was originally, but also not how it would have developed normally in that context. The next category is Deshaj, which I didn't write down a translation. Sorry. And those are, I think, just borrowings that are not quite certain. Those are actually words where we're not quite sure. Not me, I don't know anything, but where Indologists are not quite sure where they come from, so probably borrowed from non-Indo-Aryan languages. The next one would be Perso-Arabic loanwords. If you encounter Hindi, for example, you can see that a lot of words not only sound different, but also are written down different, which is where those small dots beneath some consonants are written, and those dots are called nukta. That are sounds that are not original to the Hindustani languages, but come originally from Arabic or sometimes from Persian, and then are borrowed into. There's lots of examples there. What I wrote down is Suban, which means language, but there's also Darwaza, which means door, or there's also Azadi, which means freedom. Okay, and now I would like to talk a bit about the actual changes that happen phonologically to those words, not only how they are borrowed or where they're borrowed from. We begin at first with Sanskrit. I will just name some changes, and I hope this is more or less interesting. There's no way I could tell all of them, and also systematically sort of explain how they occurred. I mean, it's just too much, and that's also quite complicated. But one of those that are really common we can see in a lot of times is that a dental, which is a sound that comes around the teeth, which is dental means, becomes a retroflex around rhotic sounds. So a rhotic sound is anything with an R in it, or like an R. There's like a vibrant R or a proximant R, like R. But in that sense, it is more like a syllabic or a non-syllabic R, like R. One example I have here is the word prati, which turned into patti. We can see here that the R vanished and the T turned into a T, from a T to a T. Also, something that happened a lot is that the rhotic R was very common, but then over time became a normal non-syllabic R with an short I afterwards. One example for a word with a rhotic R in Sanskrit is rishi, like the wise men are called the rishis. Also another word would be rna, which is that, later turned to rin. The r became an r. Honestly, I don't really hear a lot of difference. There is one. Another one would be krita, which means done in Sanskrit, and now in today's Hindi is kiya. So the R sort of went away again, and the rest also changed. So later in the Middle Indo-Aryan age, we got some assimilations. One of them would be the notorious sh, s merge to one single sound. That is actually interesting because it can still be seen today. When I talk to some people, and especially those who come from maybe a bit more rural places, you sometimes don't really hear them distinguish at all between s, sh, and obviously not sh. The retroflex sh sound, I think, is not really used in any form anymore. Maybe just in Sanskrit, but there's no distinction whatsoever. The searcher is also not that distinct anymore. I think maybe they have a phonemic differentiation that's not anymore that strong, or they have become the same phoneme. I'm not sure, but a lot of times when somebody calls Shiva, you're not actually sure if he's saying Shiva or Siva, something in between. It's just a spectrum in your mouth where you put the tongue. Yeah, there was a merger already in the Middle Indo-Aryan period, and I think that is still clear today. But in the orthography, we can still see the three different consonants written down in their own style. There have also been some distinct changes that resemble Dravidian languages. That could have been a contact phenomenon as well. One would be a palatalization. So when we see the sounds tir, tir, dir, and dir, they change into chir, chia, jir, and jir. S becomes H in clusters around nasals and stops. A lot of times an M or an N just turn into an anusvara, which is like a half nasal sound. And there's also medial clusters, which get simplificated over time. One example I wrote down is Sanskrit sapta, means seven. In Middle Indo-Aryan, we got something like satta. And in New Indo-Aryan, like in Hindi, we have just sad. Another one would be cluster simplification over time. One example is dudgda, which is milk, and later in the Prakrit we have dudha, and in New Indo-Aryan there's just dud. Dudh. Another one would be Viagra, which turns to Vagra. That is tiger, and funnily enough, also where the medication for erections comes from. So I'm not quite sure why, but my professor told me they are named after the word for tiger. Other changes are from the split of Pali and Prakrit, Y for Titian to J. In Sanskrit, there's a relative pronoun like Yah, or in some surroundings, it's more like Yo. That just means like the one who, blah blah blah. And in today's Hindi, the same word actually exists, but it just underwent a change to j. So today you say Admi jo khata hai, so the man who eats. Here Yah turned to jo. There's some later changes in the Prakrit Apabramsha. One which I think is interesting is that sometimes an M in the middle position turns into an Anusvara and a V. So the word grama in Sanskrit means village, and that becomes later Gamba. So the R is also lost, and later in Hindi turns into Gaon. So today, like a huge city next to Delhi is called Gurgaon. It's actually called village, but I think it's not a village anymore. It's a bit like Düsseldorf in Germany, which is not a Dorf at all. That is a change that happened in some Prakrits, but for example not in Gujarati, because in Gujarati the word for village is today still Gam. The M never disappeared there. Now we get to changes that happened in the new Indo-Aryan era. So sometimes retroflexes like n and l changed to normal, not retroflexed N and L. Sometimes an initial V turned into a B, so the Sanskrit word vala turns into bal in Hindi, that is hair, from a dentolabial sound to a bilabial sound. Yeah. Another big important change is from Old Hindi to New Hindi, so an earlier form of Hindi, which wasn't anymore any Prakrit, but wasn't the Hindi spoken today. There has been a change where the short vowel in the end of a word in Sanskrit, that is almost like a schwa, but in Sanskrit it's written with there's actually nothing written, but there's no virama, which indicates that in the end of a word there's no in the auslav. I think it's called auslav. Deva means God, but in Hindi it's Dev. And there's countless examples of words like that. Also, like vana means forest, and in Hindi you might say van. Okay, I've talked enough about, I think, enough about changes now. Maybe now it's spent a small chunk of time about the Indian scripts. I don't want to lose track here again, so I'll make it fast. In India, there was something called the Brahmi scripts, and that one developed over time into many other scripts across the Indian subcontinent. And if you look closely, you can see this relation still today in some sense. If you look at scripts like Gujarati and Punjabi and Devanagari and Bengali, there are some similarities which can be spotted. They can look quite different, and also the Dravidian languages of the south use scripts that stem from the Brahmi script, even though the language is fully unrelated, like the Arabic script, which is used by a lot of Semitic languages, but also a lot of Indo-Aryan languages which are not related. The next point I wrote down was Indian English. It's such a weird form of English because, as I said, there's very little native speakers which really had English as the first language, and the ones who are probably the upper 1%, but still it's ever present in everyday India. You hear English all the time, you hear it used by Hindi speakers, you hear also the notorious Hinglish, which is Hindi and English mixed. Yeah, especially those speakers might code switch from one sentence to another, or maybe even in one sentence between two languages. For outsiders like me, most of the time seems fully random. I can't really understand why they would switch at that particular moment, but yeah, it's sort of like something like bilingualism. In Indian English, you say click a picture, not take a picture. You can say off the switch, not turn off the switch or turn off the light. They are official Indian English phrases that are in the Indian English dictionary. So this is the fun part of the video. I will just share some stuff, and it might be linguistically interesting, it might be just some random shit. I've noticed that a lot of signs are in Devanagari script, but also somehow in the Arabic script, so Urdu. I'm not quite sure what that is because institutionally I think Urdu has no official status in India, but I could be wrong. It's just that I wasn't really used to seeing a lot of Urdu the last time I was in India. I've seen like a lot of signs in Hebrew. I presume it's because of tourists from Israel, but I just don't understand what makes it so appealing to make your sign only solely in Hebrew. Yeah, there's an Indian and a German arm wrestling. Yeah, just thought that's funny. It was a draw in the end. Yeah, also one thing I've seen is there's a water brand called Aquajal. I think that was also a bit funny because those are just two different words for water. They might just go all the way and call it like aqua jal pani water. Then they are really making sure that everyone understands it's water. Oh yeah, there's a lot of signs in India which are really unhinged, just straight up out there. I can't find it right now, but I saw a train wagon which was called Come Tool Van. I'm not sure what that was about. So thank you a lot for watching. I hope this was interesting, and yeah, maybe I'll do stuff like that again in the future. Okay, thank you a lot, and namaskar.